book of the week from last week that I'll talk about tonight is The Genetic Lottery by Catherine Page Hardin. The Genetic Lottery, Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. And this was, there's a lot of science in this book about DNA and genetic studies, not so much about DNA specifically, but especially about genetic studies and understanding what they are and aren't, and some of the new avenues, at least they were new to me, that I was learning about of different types of research that's been done. And this book can be considered in some ways controversial in the sense that anytime we start talking about genetic differences between people, it can start to either raise some eyebrows or raise some blood pressure or raise some anxiety, because it can become a very contentious topic. And also because there's a horrible history, and still present, but very much a horrible history when it comes to using genes to differentiate people, not just come to a conclusion of difference, but to come to a conclusion of superior and inferior. And so that's why it is so dangerous, or can feel like such a hot button issue. And I might share throughout, or maybe in another segment, about my own feelings or recognition of anxieties I can have when looking at studies that are trying to understand the differences between individuals genetically, especially when it comes to certain factors, and how that makes me feel about it. Because I, of course, want to be objective, and we all strive to be objective, but we also have to all recognize that we have our biases, we have our wants for certain things to be a certain way, and it's important to be aware of that rather than deny that. I know many people would like to say, no, I'm perfectly objective, I'm not biased, I just want to know the truth. And we all have that, but we also have these biases that are there, and it's important to understand them. And so when people hear about a book looking at DNA and related to social equality, for some people those things can seem at ends with each other. Because as she talks about in the book, both sides of the political aisle might look at these types of things differently. At times the right might think we look at genes and it tells us about differences in people, but really it's about effort and the meritocracy. People who work hard succeed. On the left, there is a huge scare about studies related to genetic differences, because there is a tendency to want to say everyone is the same. So we have to change the environment so that everyone can have equal outcomes. So it's almost the other extreme. And sometimes I could see that I had some of those sentiments or types of biases in my thinking or preferences to want to say people are the same, because that's a lot safer than saying there are these differences. Because then when we acknowledge there are differences, that could result in differential treatment. But should it? Or how should it? And she does get into some of those issues as well in this book. So going back to that history, which relates to why people, especially on the left, might be wary of any subjects or studies that are looking at the genetic differences between individuals, there is a horrible history of judging people as superior, inferior, and then using genes or hereditary factors to say this is why some people are superior, inferior. And specifically, there's a whole field or concept of eugenics, which has been used in different times of history to essentially say because some people are genetically inferior and others are genetically superior, we should keep breeding those who are superior, and even sterilize certain individuals or groups who are deemed to be somehow inferior, or do all sorts of other horrible things because these people are less human than others. And usually, and those types of words have been used to describe, for example, blacks versus whites, or certain people who have committed crimes or done certain acts. And specifically, race has been a huge issue, or has been a huge factor when we look at eugenics, that has been used to determine who is quote unquote superior and who is inferior. So we can understand there is this horrific immoral and really ugly history when it comes to looking at genes to see differences between people, especially when it comes to looking at differences between groups, that make some people think as soon as you start talking about this topic, you're already going down a bad road. You shouldn't even be doing that because it's going to open up the floodgates of some negative things to happen. But as Catherine Page Hardin describes in the book, and she talks about these issues many times throughout the book of even studying these things, why we should study them, why it's important, why it seems some people are really against it. She discusses that this is another source of information, of understanding human differences, or differences of consequence, or differences of, in a way, luck. That's why the title, The Genetic Lottery, that we need to understand. That it's important to understand, to actually, it helps us understand injustice more if we understand the genetic differences. And there is this tendency to think, well, if it's a genetic difference, somehow it's natural or it has to be this way. So if it's proven to be genetic, whatever we're talking about, that means that maybe there should be this hierarchy that exists. But why should that be the case? Why can't it be that if we actually understand who are the winners of the genetic lottery, we could make a difference in how we then treat individuals based on that? So it doesn't have to lead to more social injustice. It actually can lead to more social justice, more equality, which is the argument that she makes throughout the book. So I myself have recognized that I have this tendency to want to think that people are the same. Now, their value can be the same, and that's what I think is what we're getting at. Rather than assuming everyone is the same, it's important to recognize everyone's value, at least from my perspective, should be equal. That we don't put people above each other in a hierarchy of definitely superior or inferior, and even the ways people are treated should not be an extreme type of a difference, things that we do see in our current state of affairs in the world, and including in the United States. So it was a book that, even as I was reading it, I was very intently and intensely engaged with it, of trying to see what she was trying to say, understanding it, and as I mentioned, paying attention to my own feelings about these issues, because I could not say I was unbiased or didn't have a preference for different things and how they would turn out. So I'll get into some of these more philosophical, moral, ethical, and even in some ways obviously political types of components of this book. But also I wanted to mention, as I was talking about, people can get very wary about comparing people of different groups when it comes to their genetic material or DNA. But as of yet, there aren't these studies, the ones that she's describing, genome-wide association studies, where we could say, and she describes different types of studies, that's one of them, but we have not, or there have not been comparisons of different groups when it comes to these types of things, or different races. And she gets into some of the genetic understanding of how complex this is and why the research has been the way it does. Some of it is the biases that exist in most research, but most of it has been within individuals of European descent, individuals who in the United States would identify as white. And even still, it's hard to make comparisons between groups. Oftentimes, it could be even within a family, you might be able to make certain determinations, or sometimes within certain groups, but it can't be that you can say, for example, blacks and whites differ in this way, at least at this time. We cannot make those kinds of conclusions. So one of the fears that we have, at least the research is not there to give that kind of an indication, and it's much more complicated than that, as she explains in the book. Oftentimes we can't even make those comparisons because of the genetic material that we're talking about and the way that genes are passed down. We can't always make those comparisons, or they might not be possible. So this idea that races can be compared, or even that race is a genetically real thing, is a very complex issue, and she does get into that in the book as well. But as she describes, there does seem to be research that suggests that certain genes, for example, or certain there are sets of genes that can be related to academic success, for example, which is very important when it comes to overall life satisfaction and well-being and even physical health, mental health in most countries, most Western countries, and somewhere like the United States, how far you can go academically. And so each of these factors or each of these genes often have a small impact individually, but overall they can have an impact on, it's not that it causes academic success, so we have to be aware of even the language or the way we talk about these things, but can contribute or we can say predispose you to having a genetic advantage when it comes to doing well in school. Even something like being a morning person, what's sometimes called to being described as being a lark compared to being a owl, like a night owl. So larks are individuals who prefer waking up earlier. Night owl would be someone who likes to sleep later and wake up later. And so because of how our school systems are set up or school days are set up, if you are a morning person, if your way of awake and sleeping is that you prefer being awake in the early morning, you're going to be at an advantage when it comes to doing well in school. Now, here's what we can see, that sometimes when we say, a genetic advantage, it definitely doesn't mean something superior, but it could mean just because of the environment and the way that things are in our current society or the way it is at this time or has been, that is an advantage that gives someone an advantage. And so we could see how if we understood that, would it be fair to then reward someone because of their genes being a certain way compared to someone else? Could we say that it's their fault? And even this concept of responsibility and blame and free will also is discussed in the book in trying to understand what this all means. But we can see how sometimes what gives someone an advantage is something fairly arbitrary, and even if it wasn't, maybe we shouldn't have such a big difference, but why should someone be given some kind of an advantage because of that? So nonetheless, zooming out again, there are these ways of looking at certain factors that might contribute to an individual having a genetic advantage, doing something that's called, or creating something called a polygenic index, I think it's called, where we can now look at seeing, are there a set of factors that might contribute genetically to you being somehow having an advantage in a certain way or a certain type of activity that we're talking about? And then we can, if we have this type of information within a group, we can see how strong your score is. That's the polygenic index that you would get. Based on all these genes, where would you score? And we can see that there is some correlation between how well you do academically and how much you have of these factors. And so, but she does explain also, as I mentioned, that it's not a causal thing. So we can't say you have to be better at school or you definitely would be better at school. Kind of like, let's say, brown eyes. It's very much determined by your genes. There's not a lot of the environment that's going to affect that. But these factors, there's much more environmental input and interplay. It's not just a one-way type of a thing where environment affects genes. There's going to be an interplay between those two things. But it still can have an impact, or overall we can see that these things make a difference. And so to say some people are predisposed to do better academically, you can ask yourself, how does that make you feel? For some people, it doesn't feel very good, or it brings up these fears of how are we going to treat individuals differently. But I also think what I felt reading this book is that one of her points was we're trying to just, in understanding whatever it is, we're understanding the world, people, different factors that affect how well people do in life in different ways. We want to have all the information, and it would be, in a way, ridiculous to think that genes don't play a role at all, that genetic information or this genetic knowledge or understanding plays no part in success in schools or mental health or different aspects of life. It wouldn't make sense. And it does seem that we're more comfortable saying, for example, yes, genes are related to height, or genes might be related to autism or related to being born deaf. We can be very comfortable with those things, but when people talk about success in school and success financially, those types of things, people can feel a lot less okay with it, because I think it brings up these tendencies that what if it's used, or it initially just automatically feels like it's going to be a way of distinguishing people as being superior and inferior, and people rightfully so are not okay with that. But because of that, they won't even start the conversation. And as she talks about in the book, what happens is when people on the left are not willing to even open these conversations, will say the research is pointless, we shouldn't even be doing this type of research, it's a wrong place to begin. What happens is actually those who have bad intentions, who are very racist, who want to use this information in negative ways, they will actually get the information and twist it and put it in a way that actually puts forward their arguments more strongly. So actually by ignoring it, we're allowing it to be used as a weapon in the wrong direction. So what I'd like to do after the break is continue the discussion, because I gave more of some of the book, but some backgrounds, but some of the things that's brought up in this book, which is still something I have to continue thinking about. But I do highly recommend it, The Genetic Lottery by Catherine Page Hardin. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Continuing the discussion on the book, The Genetic Lottery, Why DNA Matters for Social Equality by Catherine Page Hardin. And, you know, one theme that also comes up for me, I mean, came up throughout the book, but when we're thinking about looking at this type of research or looking at things in general, is what type of a world would you like to create? An egalitarian one, or one that's more egalitarian, meaning more equal distribution of resources and people being taken care of, or more inegalitarian, meaning that there's more hierarchy and things are spread out more, and some people have not very much and some people might have much more. And so if you approach things with a egalitarian mindset, which many on the left would have or do have, then, as she puts it, it's important for you to understand genetics, because the genetic effects or inputs that are being made on outcomes, the more we understand them, the more we actually can create interventions and things that will help people more. So not knowing it doesn't help us at all. Knowing it can help us actually make a better impact, make things more fair. And she also shares some of the philosophy or some quotes from John Rawls, which I'll share, I think, at the end of the segment. But to give you an idea of how, when we learn about, okay, there's a genetic reason why, let's say, some children do better in school, and this can make us a little bit nervous, but we can see how unfounded it might be to really make the genetic connection in a certain way. She shares from sociologist Sandy Jenks in 1972 came up with this type of a thought experiment to make us recognize, you know, what it might look like when we say genes lead to a contribution or let's say an advantage in academic success or disadvantage. So this is from Sandy Jenks in the book The Genetic Lottery. If, for example, a nation refuses to send children with red hair to school, the genes that cause red hair can be said to lower reading scores. Attributing redheads' illiteracy to their genes would probably strike most readers as absurd under these circumstances, yet that is precisely what traditional methods of estimating heritability do. So we can see this example. I think it does, when I read it, I was like, oh, that's a very good example of showing how it could be there's a genetic reason or a genetic explanation for a certain characteristic or outcome, but because of the environment, because of laws, because of what could be, let's say, something like systematic racism, or in this case, hair colorism, we could then see that it's not because of those genes creating some outcome, but the environment that is creating that. And that's what we do see in the United States with a lot of these issues, that it is a lot of the system that is creating these outcomes, not necessarily the genes. But I think we also don't know that so well because of the studies haven't been done yet, or enough hasn't been done yet to understand those things. But we can't shy away from that. We need to continue to do the research and embrace it head on. She also says, you know, some people have a hard time holding many of the arguments together. It becomes very black and white. So here she says both things can be true at the same time. Genetics can be causes of stratification in society and measures to address systematic social forces can be effective at enacting social change. So there can be genetic influences on things, but also it doesn't mean we can't do things to make a more just society, or to equalize things, or to have interventions to help individuals, let's say, or to change the environment to make things more fair. So just by acknowledging that genetics can play a role doesn't mean that's the end. Although that's what sometimes people think. If it's genetic, then it somehow absolves society of having to do something about it, or that makes it somehow fair, which I think this points back to these notions of inferior and superior that we have had throughout history, still have, and can still, I think, even unknowingly fall into. Because let's say someone has an advantage that makes them more likely to do well academically. They're just born into that. Usually people are very comfortable saying it's not fair to treat people differently based on the family they were born into, right? So if one child was born into extreme poverty and one was born into wealth, and then the one who was in the wealthy environment gets all these types of advantages from being in that wealthy family, well, most people would agree it's not fair to say the wealthy child has done better or deserves more or has more merit. Looking at this phrase of a meritocracy, it would be unfair, most people would say, to say that person has done more, that child has done more, and that poor child who was born into the poor family deserves if they were not able to have such a good outcome. Most people would say, no, that's not true. That's an accident of birth. But this phrase, the genetic lottery, is capturing that same concept that, well, if you are born with different genes that can have an impact, should that be used against you or used in your favor, whichever way if you've either won or lost, so to speak, in the genetic lottery, or how well you've won in it, should that have an impact, or should you be rewarded for that? And I think it would make sense that shouldn't be the case, that if you were born with certain genetic advantages, that's good, and that might have a certain impact in how you experience things, and depending on the society you live in might confer some advantages, but how much? What should be that differential? And I think, unfortunately, we still live in a world where the advantages are far too extreme, and should there be any advantage at all? That's something that we should be thinking about and looking at. So this book did make me have to ask myself some interesting questions, or some pretty difficult questions of trying to answer what should it look like, what is fair. But I do think she made her arguments quite well in the book in trying to understand, well, if this is the way that things are, some people are just genetically more lucky, so to speak. How should we then respond to that? And the thing is, again, it's not saying comparing different races, because I think that's where people's minds go. But even within the same family, so there's studies looking at, because of how things work with sexual reproduction, you don't get all of your parents' genes. Or even, we say you get 50% of your genes, or you share 50% of your genes with, let's say, your siblings. But that's actually not an exact number. She shared that her and her brother were, I think, about 48%. They shared their genetic material, because there's all sorts of ways that you can inherit different parts of your parents' genome, that they could be the same or they could be different in a different range. And I think the range was anywhere from like 30 to 60%, something like that siblings could be genetically related. And this is all accidents of birth and reproduction and the way that things go, the sperm and the egg that come together. And then also, of course, mutations and things can happen as well to further create differences. But even within the same family, there could be a genetic lottery where one child might have way more advantages to be successful academically than the other one, let's say. She uses that example a lot because I think her research, and there's been other research on it, but there's research showing that. So would it be fair for that child to be rewarded so much more? Would it be fair even for those parents to be so much more proud or give so much more attention to that child who maybe was just born with a genetic advantage? It wasn't really the fault of the other child, and it wouldn't be fair to blame or to punish or to not give certain resources or favors for that younger child or other child. It would make sense to treat them equally, we would think. What does that mean? So that's why I think this theme of the book is important, that if we ignore this, we're actually ignoring a potential source of inequality, or maybe exacerbating and blaming people who are in certain positions, not recognizing there really is a genetic lottery, so to speak, because of the potential combinations of genes that we can have, even when it comes to what you inherit from your parents, that is worth keeping in mind. So as I mentioned, she quotes the philosopher John Rawls, who he had a type of thought experiment, or imagined something called the veil of ignorance. And so in the veil of ignorance, actually, I'll read this paragraph that's from John Rawls that's in the book. No one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does he know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence and strength and the like. Nor again does anyone know his conception of the good, the particulars of his rational plan of life, or even the special features of his psychology, such as his aversion to risk or liability, to optimism or pessimism. So if we had this veil of ignorance, that you don't know what you were going to be like genetically, what type of family you were going to be born into, your psychological strengths and weaknesses, and all these types of things, if you really didn't know how you would be and where your position would be in society, what type of a society would you design? Or how would you want things to be for a fair and just type of a society? And most people, if they really didn't know, would probably not think, well, some people should be incredibly wealthy and have so much, and many more should actually be suffering and barely making it, or not having enough resources to survive. I don't think most people would. I think a lot of people, in a self-serving way, would think, well, even if I was born with those disadvantages, I would find a way out, or I would definitely be successful. But I think that is not really understanding the reality of what the world is like. And would we want to create a world that was unjust with such extremes? I don't think so. And so I really like this thought experiment by John Rawls of trying to really think of what should the world look like, what should it be like. And this notion of being different is one thing, but being superior and inferior is the issue that we have. And that's unfortunately what we've done throughout society, is create these hierarchies, or especially in Western society, created these hierarchies of people being better than, worse than. Even before, there's things like royalty and nobility and being born into a certain status that made you superior to others, and some people were born being inferior. But this really does seem to be the way we just conceptualize things, not based on something real. And I think that's a point to me that's important when we try to look at any kind of research like this, that we might notice differences, and we shouldn't be afraid of differences. They obviously exist, and even we celebrate them. We celebrate things like diversity. So if we're celebrating diversity, we can't, on the other token, then say, well, everyone's the same. That wouldn't make sense. But do people have different value? Should we value them differently? That's where it really matters. So people are different, can be different, and we enjoy that, celebrate that, even need that as a society, for people to have different strengths and different capacities, skills, gifts that they can share with the world. But we shouldn't value people differently. The hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, that's the problem, not the differences. And when we look at something like luck and privilege, I know privilege has this certain connotation now that some people don't like, but really some people were born lucky, and also the world is a lot of luck. It's not to say we don't have an impact on it, or that you don't make choices, or there's no free will. There definitely is. But I think to ignore luck in the variety of factors, from the family you're born into to life circumstances, and even genetically, as this book describes, is something that we just like to tell ourselves it was because of us and something we did, rather than all the other factors. And I like this quote that she has in here from E.B. White, which is, luck is not something you can mention in the presence of self-made men. Luck is not something you can mention in the presence of self-made men, because, of course, they want to say that whatever success they have was purely due to themselves. And this is not to reduce the efforts that people make to, whether it's working on themselves, working on businesses, whatever it is that they work on. It's not to say that doesn't matter, but to not recognize the role of luck, I think, is really faulty. And so I'll conclude by reading one of the last paragraphs in the book that I really like. This is the second last paragraph from the book that does, I think, encapsulate some of her main themes and arguments throughout the book. So here it is. Some people happen to inherit combinations of genetic variants that, in combination with environments provided by parents and teachers and social institutions, cause them to be more likely to develop a suite of skills and behaviors that are currently valued in the formal education systems of Western capitalist societies. They are not better people. They are not more inherently meritorious. They are, given the ways our society is currently structured, the least vulnerable. And if you're reading this book, you are probably one of them. And so people have different genetic variations and combinations, and it's the combination of those genes with the environment and what the environment values. I'm looking at my bookmark here, a Lakers ticket from a few years ago, and LeBron James is here and on the ticket, and of course he has some genetic advantages. He's worked incredibly hard, but in our society today, it could be something that can make you incredibly successful and wealthy and powerful. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can imagine another world where that wouldn't be the case. And so we can see that there's these combinations of genes and society and environments that have an impact. But the more we don't know about the genetic impact, the less we can really understand about how to create a more fair society. And so to me, that was interesting to think about it in that way. And it's still something I'll have to continue to process what I learned from this book and continue to learn from it. But I think it's an important one for everyone to read, to understand what genes can and can't tell us, and also to understand how this can help us better understand what it means to make or bring about social equality, as the subtitle explains. So again, that was The Genetic Lottery by Catherine Page Hardin. Let's go to our last commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So today I was talking about the book The Genetic Lottery, Why DNA Matters for Social Equality by Catherine Page Hardin. And so in life, we have basically come into this life with a lot of different lotteries that we've won, lost, or to different degrees won or lost. And as I mentioned, there's this phrase that comes up where you've probably heard privilege. And like a lot of things that comes up that's new, it often gets misused or even abused at times. So people will say, check your privilege, and oftentimes it's used as a way of almost ending a conversation. So you can make a point, but if someone doesn't know what to say back, or they want to really end it and basically say your point doesn't even matter, or you can't even have an opinion on the matter, they might say check your privilege, meaning that because you come from a privileged background, or you're privileged when it comes to this topic or conversation, you really can't have an input, or you have to defer to others and things of that sort, which I think is not really a good use of the word, or it's really used as just basically a tool to end a conversation or try to win an argument. And I think that's problematic. But I do think in the context of reading a book like this and just thinking about life in general, that it's important to recognize that we have, looking at yourself, what types of ways maybe you have been lucky or unlucky as well, but have been lucky. And so I think this brings up themes of this same concept of superiority or inferiority. So in some ways, we don't want to say genetically we're superior in some way. And so that's happened throughout history and still happens, that we're just better than because of our blood. I hear this a lot still. Our blood is different, so that makes us better than these other people or this other group. Or our family line is something significant, so we're better than them. So we sometimes look for these reasons, and I think that's why there is this fear and anxiety about genetic research, that it's going to be used by some people to prove their superiority, which cannot be done. But we are at times looking for a way or to look for something that makes us superior. I'm better than others. I think there is this need to try to prove that in one way or the other. Or we try to say, if I was successful or I've done well, it was all from my own hard work and determination, and I wasn't lucky. I faced setbacks. So if I'm successful, it's just me. As that quote I read from E.B. White, you can't have a conversation about luck in a room full of self-made men, because they won't see that luck was at all part of them being successful. But I think it's important to be realistic about this. And when we say someone has a privilege in some way or has some luck, it doesn't mean they have no hardship. Every biological life experiences hardship and then experiences death at its end. So every life has pains and hardships and discomforts that come up and big things you've experienced. So if someone even recognizes or says you have some type of a privilege. First of all, I also think when you tell people you are this or you had that, it usually doesn't go well. But that's why I'm saying for us each to reflect on it ourselves. You know, when you think about that, well, was I privileged? You think, no, but this bad thing happened to me, or I had this challenge. And both of those things can be true. You can be privileged, let's say, to be born into a certain family, or to be born at a certain time or a certain part of the country or the world, or different things that gave you an advantage, but you also experienced hardships. I actually could be certain that it's going to be both, that you have some advantages, but you also experienced hardships. It's not going to be one or the other. So it's not that either you experience pure hardship or pure privilege. That doesn't exist for anyone. But it can be important to keep those things in mind. Sometimes I imagine when you go to a graduation, let's say high school graduation, college graduation, graduate school graduation, everyone is getting the same degree. And so we're celebrating the same thing. Okay, everyone got their, bachelor's degree, but not everyone has had the same journey and has had the same hardships. And usually I would think more of the things like financial resources and different discrimination that people could experience. So some people have to work jobs, multiple jobs, while they're in school and deal with other family issues and challenges just trying to get themselves to school. And someone else might not, and also have access to tutors and things, and that's at the other extreme. Of course, now reading this book, I can also consider there's a genetic lottery that some students it is going to be easier for them to get through it, or have those barriers of doing well in school be a little bit easier for them than others. And, there's other things involved as well. But we can see when we're looking at that graduation stage, they've all got to the same finish line, but the path hasn't been as simple or as easy for one person over the other. And so there are advantages that are there. And again, even it's not just the financial, it could just be school could be easier slightly, let's say, for one person or the other. So I think it's good to look at that. And if I think of my own educational journey, and it actually did have some ups and downs in it as well, and some challenges that I faced. Maybe I created them myself. Maybe there was predispositions to certain things, whatever you want to call it. But I definitely know I had some advantages that were there that did make it easier for me to succeed. And so when I think of that, I think, well, but I also worked hard. I can think of that. And I did. And I had struggles, and it was hard. And it wasn't that it was easy, but I can't deny that there were some things that made it easier for me, or that could have been more challenging had they been different. And that's just the reality. And both things can be true, that you've been given some type of a, whatever you want to call it, luck, and then throughout life there's other aspects of luck too. And with it, you hopefully will make the best of it that you can. But the reality is the reality. And I think we have to be realistic with that and not be afraid to acknowledge that. And it doesn't take away from who you are either way, whether you were given bad luck or good luck. But I think in a search of being meaningful, even if we have to be superior at times, we try to be superior, we want to find a reason to say that we were better than others, either in how we were born or because we've worked so hard and worked so well that we've gotten there, when really there's going to be a combination of things that gets us to where we are that we need to keep in mind. So I reflected on that as well, and while reading this book, of looking at myself and my life, and that I am fortunate in a lot of ways. And that because of that, does that mean I should get certain advantages? Probably not. And so it goes back to that concept of John Rawls that if we had a veil of ignorance, what would be fair? And we always are going to have biases that when you have things that feel good, you don't want to lose them. And we've seen this throughout society, that people with power, people with advantages want to always believe there's some reason why it is that way. In the book Capital and Ideology by Thomas Piketty, I was very impacted by his thesis that throughout history and currently in the present time, there's always been inequality, and there's always been reasons that have been made to justify that inequality, whether it was before, as I mentioned, like nobility or royalty. Well, these people are just born different, or this person comes from God or something like that that makes them better, and the rest are just the peasants, and they should just be lucky that they get to serve, live in this society. Or more recently, the meritocracy, that it's just based on hard work. And that so if people have way more money and all this stuff, that's how it's supposed to be too. This is somehow justifiable to have these extremes. But these are just stories we tell ourselves, that it's all this way, that it's a meritocracy, and that nothing else other than how hard you work determines if you're successful, let's say in the United States. If you really think that that's the case, I think it's really like believing a fairy tale, that the only thing that matters in being successful in the United States is how hard you work. How hard you work makes an impact. So yes, there is something you can do. And this is one of those things where we always look at what is in my control and what isn't. The genetic lottery and things about society, of course, you can try to bring about social change, but in the bigger picture, you can't change a lot of that. That's out of your control. What is in your control, that's what you want to try to do to the best of your ability. So that you should do. But then to look at the results and say they are somehow the only way it could have been, or they're completely just or fair, I think that's ridiculous, and that's not something that I could agree with, even in looking at my own life. And so reading this book actually made me think even more strongly about how we should strive towards an egalitarian society, which was, I don't want to say surprising, but I wasn't sure what I would think reading this book, because it was going to bring up genetics and genetic differences and how there's a impact in how it might lead to success in certain factors. I didn't know, would that contribute more to the sense that it's right for these things to be that way, that there should be these differences and people should be given certain successes and certain resources and certain advantages based on these things. But actually it was the opposite. It was making me realize even more that we need to put more effort into creating a more just society, which means actually understanding the different ways that different genes interact with the current world and structures that we have and environments that we have, and how to make them more fair. We have to understand that and strive even more towards making things fair. That if a child, for example, is born with certain disadvantages educationally, or in their educational attainment, should they have to live a life of poverty or a life that's unhealthy or less healthy? I think that doesn't make sense. The child was just born into that. Going back to this concept of it's not just about the family you were born into as far as, let's say, wealth or poverty or educational attainment, socioeconomic status, as we hear a lot of times. There's a genetic type of component to it as well, which I think does bring up always a sensitive issue, but I hope it isn't one that we shy away from. It is one that we embrace and go into, because I think it is going to be necessary to create a more just society. And as she talks about in the book, if we don't take it seriously, some people will, and they'll use it for bad reasons to try to justify inequalities, justify explanations of superiority and inferiority that will further contribute to injustice and things like racism. And lastly, to conclude this concept of checking your privilege. Yes, I know it sounds very cliche and makes people cringe even when you hear it because of the ways that it's been used. But I think it's important in recognizing ourselves and being real with ourselves and having some genuine humility to recognize advantages that you've had that other people have not had, and that you are lucky for certain things and probably unlucky for others as well, but to recognize the sum total of those things, that maybe you've been luckier than others, and if that's the case, is it fair for you to have those advantages, or should you strive towards making a more just world? I hope you will strive towards making a more just world, a more egalitarian world, where everyone can be taken care of and have their basic needs and liberties and freedoms met. Doesn't mean everyone is the same. We still have differences, but we don't need to have hierarchies. You can have differences without some kind of hierarchy that implies inferiority and superiority, and also implies how you get to live a life of either comfort or discomfort. That brings us to the end of tonight's show. As always, a big thank you to Amir here in the studio. You've been listening to In Session with Dr. Farid. Have a wonderful night.